Hello, my name is Dr. Arie VandeWaa. I'm the professor of trombone at the University of South Alabama, and you're listening to the 2022 All-State High School Technical Commentary Podcast. With this piece, there are two really big challenges. The first one is the tempo. 108 BPM is a little bit on the uncomfortable side of single tonguing for most of us. I know for me that's kind of right on the cusp of my consistent ability level, right? I have to practice a lot to get up to 108. But the downside is it's also a little too slow to get a good, clear double tongue without us hearing the "k" syllable every time. So what I recommend, remember, first and foremost, all-state tempos are always recommendations. If 108 is too challenging for you to single tongue, then go somewhere in the 90 to 100 range. Okay, you don't have to go all the way up there. That'll be allegro enough, and you just want to shoot for somewhere in that spectrum. Okay. Now, for you double tonguers who are really good at double tonguing and you want to, this is a good one, and maybe going faster can help with some of the breathing later on, which is the other big issue in this piece. I recommend not going too fast, okay? You don't want to go at 140 or something like that, right? That's going to be uncharacteristic, and it's going to be difficult for the judges to weight that with people they've heard before. Some of them might think it's great. Some of them might think it's not, okay? So I recommend shooting for a speed maybe around that 110 to 115 range if you're double tonguing to help cover up the "k," the second syllable in a double tongue, okay? Now, remember too, don't make any last-minute changes to tempo on audition day, okay? If you haven't played it at 108 on the day of the audition or 115 if you're double tonguing, that is not the time to start, right? You want to make sure that you've played it a bunch of times before then, that you're comfy with that tempo and that you can control it. A lot of times in auditions, our adrenaline kicks in, and we like to rush rather than drag. Okay, so you may also want to practice this a little faster than 108 or your top tempo so that you make sure that if you get there, you can control it as much as possible. Now, I already mentioned this. The other big challenge is breathing, particularly in the second half. So I have a couple spots that I recommend you try to do to try to make this easier. First, I recommend you play measures 210 to 218 in one breath if possible. If you can't, the goal is just as few breaths as you can. Okay, so only one breath, only two breaths, no more. All right. Now that'll get you to those eighth notes where you can breathe after those. Right, the bum 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 bum. That section is the next best spot to squeeze a breath in. Now, the other spot that I like to breathe and use to kind of get enough oxygen is in that crazy part where it's just straight 16th notes, right? And this is in measures 227 and 231. You can hear it in the recording. I like to breathe after the C's. One of the reasons I do this is because it makes the most sense musically because of the change of register and articulation. But the other thing is that I just can't make it all the way to the end of the page in one breath. So I have to get that breath in. This allows me to kind of create some phrasing and some shape and make sure that every articulation speaks, okay? This will also make it okay and possible to make it all the way to that downbeat in 234 to tank up after that eighth note for the intense B-flat major arpeggio and inversions that you have coming up with a high B-flat. Remember, when it comes to breathing for this, Jean-Baptiste Arban was a trumpet player. He was not a trombone player. He was not a euphonium player. And these solos have been transcribed down to be more appropriately playable in our registers. The downside is breathing is an issue for us, right, compared to trumpets. So breathe when you need to. Air is free. Make sure it's always a healthy, efficient, quick breath. All right, that's your goal. Again, the other part with these straight 16th notes and breathing, if you're sticking at one tempo and not accelerandoing like a performer like Arban might have done, you want to make sure that you're consistent in where you breathe and that you're not letting the breath interrupt the time too much. Now, you can hear it in mine. The time actually gets a little bit of a delay after that breath, right? There's a little hitch in the giddy up. That's okay because you're going to need that air, and it's more important you have a good sound and that you're demonstrating that, to be frank, there was no good place to breathe, right? So as long as you're in control and you're not losing control, those breaths and that little pause there are totally fine. If you have problems with this, if you can't make these breaths or you don't like them or they don't feel good for you, all that I would recommend is that you be very consistent in where you breathe when you practice, right? Mark your chosen breaths down, okay, so that you are always aiming for the same spot, always creating the same sense of phrase, and always getting a good, efficient, healthy breath. The other thing a lot of people run into with this one is the high B flat, right? Especially if you're a freshman and sophomore, you might have issues with range. It will help if you put a little bit of a crescendo through the arpeggio leading up to it. And when you get to that B flat, think T for the articulation. Ta 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 T, right, can kind of help create a little bit of extra pressure at the last minute. Another thing I run into with students who have issues with high notes, especially like this one where notes come after it, is that they might be able to squeak out the top note, but they're not ready for the rest of the arpeggio. It's part of a phrase. So think of the phrase as a very vocal airstream, a very lyrical airstream, if you will, and blow through the B flat. It's not enough just to hit it. You have to keep going, right? You're not done at the high B flat. This sort of phrase-oriented breathing and articulating will help you in the long run and actually should lead to more success of you hitting the high notes. Now, let's talk about some more of these sort of separator details, right? Those are all sort of the big picture things, the things we might all struggle with. Let's talk about some other things that work that we can use to our advantage in the audition. First, make sure your dynamics and articulations are exactly what's on the page, all right? Remember, these judges are looking for these separators, things to distinguish you from whoever played before or after you. And being super exact with the articulations is a huge separator, okay? Second, dynamics and phrasing, which we just mentioned, are also the really good things to focus on if you've made white band in the past and you really want to make red band or something like that. This is something to spend a lot of time on. I recommend checking out the Arbon's version that's edited by Joseph Alessi and Brian Bowman for phrasing, because that edition actually has some printed hairpin crescendos and diminuendos in it that can be really helpful for breath management. It might actually help you make some of these phrases better. Now, keep in mind that edition has different notes and some other different dynamics printed in it, so you don't want to use that for your audition itself. It's more of to help you figure out this phrasing concept, okay? Again, stick with the edition that they require. The Mancia edition is great. It just doesn't have those interior phrasing markings. As a rule, with this sort of style, it's appropriate to crescendo as the notes ascend and diminuendo as they descend, okay? You don't want to necessarily do this all the time and every single time it changes, but it can sometimes help with the breath management and creates a very musical picture, all right? You want to manage that airflow in a way that is compelling and exciting, but that also helps you technically play the etude. Next, your mezzo fortes in general will probably be too loud, okay? So make sure that you're backing off a little bit. You're not overblowing the mezzo fortes. Just because it has that F, right, doesn't mean that it's everything you got. So hold back a little bit. This will also help with your airstream. If you're too loud, you're never going to make your breath very far, right? You have to be a little bit more conservative with your air on this etude. Last but not least, 4 articulations in the very first section, in the piano section. Kind of like I said in the lyrical, 1, don't start too softly, but softly enough where it's comfy. And then 2, focus on these articulations a bit. With these groupings of 2 eighth notes, it is perfectly acceptable to add clarity to that phrase marking by putting a little bit of space between the second note in that phrase and the next note after it. So, bottom, bottom, bottom. What you don't want is you don't want a super short staccato. That's a separate articulation marking that does have a staccato over that note, and that's ba-deet, da-deet, da-deet, right? That's a very sharp stop to the note. Let it have a little bit of taper with a tiny amount of space, okay? This is particularly important, for example, in measure 193, where we have these 2-note phrases back to back. If we just play those with a da tongue, we're going to get da-da, da-da, right? I couldn't resist. I even put a little space in there. If we add that space, da-dum, da-dum, we actually do what's on the page more accurately. And that, again, is going to help your score. And, of course, I always say this, but it's an important thing to remember both for this and for band and every time you touch your instrument. Staccatos are short, but they're not that short, okay? As a rule, high school players tend to play super short and spitty because it can help them with rhythms in ensemble playing. You want to make sure that you have enough sound on every note, even the short notes, that you have good tone, good pitch, and that anyone listening to you can tell what you just played and how it sounds. Thank you, guys. Again, I'm Dr. Arie VandeWaa at the University of South Alabama, and I hope you've enjoyed the commentary. Happy practicing.